Well, here I am in my basement, thinking about the world and what to do about it. I had a conversation the other day with a friend. We're having lunch together, and we were talking about what's happening in the world and how appalled we are by it, and about the fact that nothing seems to be changing. And here we are, a couple of old men. I'm almost 82. My friend's, maybe 5 years younger than I am. And we're kind of commiserating about, okay, we're concerned about the world. We're concerned about justice in the world, but what are we doing? My friend, by the way, is doing a lot more than I am. He's involved with groups of addicts. He's involved with people in education and in business. But what do? I write. I kind of teach. But anyway, we're talking and saying, well, not much seems to be happening in the world to make it a better place. And I thought about that when I got home, and I've been thinking about it since, and I'm thinking, no, that's wrong. There's a lot going on in the world, and a lot that is changing. The world is changing fundamentally. As a matter of fact, I see about 3 things happening in the world that are going to change it, that are changing it as we speak. For one thing, we have relatively small movements of protest against the injustice in this world where 1% controls, 90% of the wealth in the world, that sort of thing. We see it in Black Lives Matter, yeah. We see it in the women's movement and the outrage over the retraction of Roe v. Wade. We see it in Sri Lanka, where they've just thrown out the president of the country. They've occupied his house. They burnt down part of it. They're swimming in a swimming pool, that sort of thing. They've thrown him out. My granddaughter's in Panama now. And it caused me to look at what's happening in Panama, and a lot is happening there too. There are protests against control by the United States. There's protests going on in Puerto Rico about U.S. colonialism. It's happening in the world at that kind of relatively micro level. But at the macro level, there are lots of things happening. 2 big things, 2 big movements against the central control by Europe and the United States, that is by the big colonial powers that want to keep things the way they are. And what is the instrument for doing that? NATO. That Vijay Prashad calls, quoting someone else, I forget who it is, but the machine that destroys humanity, NATO. The machine that destroys humanity. And why is it that kind of machine? Because it wants to keep the world the way it is. With the big disparities in wealth, with people hungry, with sea levels rising, with entire nations getting wiped away by climate change. They don't want that to change. But there are 2 movements against that kind of retrogression, reactionary conservatism. And they're happening before our eyes, and they're changing the world. One is violent, the other is nonviolent. The violent one is on everybody's mind, and it's happening in Ukraine. And that is an action of Russia against that machine that destroys humanity, that is NATO. And Russia has drawn a line through its president, who is one of the most outstanding political leaders of our time, Vladimir Putin. And he's saying, no, we're not going to stand for that anymore. We are drawing the line, and we are not going to allow you to do what you've done all over the world. And what is that? What you did to us. After the fall of the Soviet Union, you installed a president that was merely a puppet. They called him Boris Yeltsin, yes. He's merely a puppet. And you robbed our country blind. You took the people's property. You privatized it. That is, you stole it from us and gave it to the wealthy, to the oligarchs. Stole it from us and installed that puppet. And then you thought that I was going to be his successor? Well, in 2007, in that speech that I gave in Munich, I drew the line there too, and I said that's not going to happen anymore. Russia's not going to take that anymore. And if you keep pushing us into a corner, all hell's going to break loose. Well, they kept pushing him into the corner. And now we have a war between Russia and that machine that destroys humanity, and Russia is winning. Yeah, it's winning. Just take a look at any of those objective channels like the military summary channel, and you'll see the Russian line moving against that machine that destroys humanity and pushing back. And that's very hopeful. And the third world, that is the global south, can see that, and they can see they tried to do to you, Russia, what they've been doing to us for 500 years. They've been installing puppets in our countries, controlling them, making regime change. They want to regime change you too, and we are behind you. We're not voting with that machine that destroys humanity. We are not voting against Russia. We see you as our proxy. This is a proxy war, but you, Russia, are a proxy for us against that machine that destroys humanity. That's one movement in the world that I can see that is changing the world. It's not going to be the same. Europe is being destroyed by its own sanctions. It's sanctioning itself anyway. It's changing Europe. It's changing the United States. Heads are rolling. Heads of government have been removed from office. Boris Johnson over in England has been removed from office. The the Prime Minister of Italy has been removed. Biden's going to be next. He's going to be next. Anyway, that's the violent movement against the machine that destroys humanity. The other one is nonviolent. And it represents about 20% of the world, and more than that, because I'm talking about China, and China is part of BRICS, B-R-I-C-S. That is the union of Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, but you can add to that Iran. You can add to that more and more countries in Latin America that are joining together in a union that represents more than 20% of humanity. And they're doing it under the banner of socialism. Or as Xi Jinping would say, socialism with Chinese characteristics. Well, that is changing the world in a nonviolent way. The Belt and Road Initiative is extending development throughout the world, and they're doing it without taking up arms against the machine that destroys humanity, as Russia is doing. China hasn't dropped a bomb on anyone in the last 50 years. The machine that destroys humanity has dropped bombs on people every day for the last 50 years and more. So I'm taking hope. I take hope from what I see as those micro movements, that violent movement, which necessarily is violent. It's a violence of self-defense. We could talk about that, but this is not the place for doing that. I've written about that before in various places. But that movement is changing the world in Ukraine. That's the battlefield. But also, China, even more importantly, in union with Russia, and in union with those other BRICS nations and more, is changing the world. And I take great hope from that. And I hope that you, by thinking about it, will take hope as well.